Hello, my name is Kevin Leomo. I'm a Scottish-Filipino composer currently undertaking a PhD in composition at the University of Glasgow. My paper is entitled Liminality in Cross-Cultural Composition. I'm going to give an overview of my cross-cultural engagement, tracing developments in my practice, such as my development of approach to sound, collaboration and notation, and examining a few key moments from this area. The concept of liminality is central to my work. Liminality can be described as a threshold state of transition, a space of in-betweenness, existing between and across boundaries. Liminality manifests in two key ways in my work, exploring transitional elements or spectra in sound, such as sound silence, fragility, stability, and stasis movement, as well as liminality as cross-cultural practice. Today, I'm going to focus on this cross-cultural practice and how I situate myself within a liminal space, existing between Western music, which my background is in, and non-Western musics, an area I have researched and collaborated with performers on several occasions. This liminal space is also important to me on a personal level, as a person of mixed race, trying to reconcile my identity and who I am as a composer. Having studied Western art music practices, I was first exposed to the notion of cross-cultural practice during my master's, where I had the opportunity to compose for Ensemble Okeanos, which is comprised of a mixture of Western and Japanese instruments. At the time, this was shakuhachi, oboe, koto, and cello. This encounter led me to research the performance practice, history, and playing techniques of the shakuhachi and koto, as well as their place in Japanese music, traditional and contemporary. Aside from learning about these instruments' physical characteristics and playing techniques, I also researched the accompanying philosophies and aesthetics of Japanese music, which are ingrained in the instruments' performance practices. I attempted to bring Western and Japanese instruments together through blending their sounds in a way that was symbolic of a cross-cultural approach, engaging in dialogue between multiple cultural sources. The resulting work examined the ensemble's fundamental juxtaposition of Japanese and Western instruments to highlight their contrasts, whilst also demonstrating how they could be brought together. I learned how a cross-cultural approach can afford a different perspective to composition, which is something I pursued further by developing different models for cross-cultural composition and collaboration. This was the first time I worked in this cross-cultural space, attempting to bridge the gap between Western instruments, and in this case Japanese instruments. Inhabiting this liminal space between two cultural practices was extremely fruitful and led me to consider the value of the synthesis or bringing together of two cultures. A reflection or a way for me to engage with being from two different cultures myself, embracing both the confluences, similarities, and differences, which are beautiful and alive. I then embarked on a number of cross-cultural works over several years, exploring different models of cross-cultural engagement. The different models included composing for non-Western instruments, composing for Western instruments, and composing for a mixture of Western and non-Western instruments. Following my initial study of Japanese instruments, I went on to write a piece for solo alto flute as part of Safa Ensemble's Composing for Flute program. Based on acquired knowledge of shakuhachi playing techniques, I created a recontextualization of shakuhachi performance practice and sound production on the Western alto flute, in order to demonstrate how traditional techniques could be repurposed into a new music idiom. Another example of this model was work I carried out for cello as well as string quartet, influenced by my research into Korean instruments haegum or fiddle and komongo, a six-string zither, following a composition for performers from the Society for New Korean Music. Similarly to the interpretation of shakuhachi to flute, I worked with cellist Emily de Simone on techniques informed by the sounds and playing methods of these two Korean instruments I worked with. My engagement with cross-cultural work has had a lasting impact on my approach to sound as well as silence. From my initial research into Japanese music, I learned about Zen Buddhism's close link with the shakuhachi and approaches to noise, sawari, and silence, ma. It was eye-opening to discover these different ways of approaching and thinking about music. What I discovered about Japanese approaches reframed my own compositional practice and how I thought about musical parameters, including sound, silence, space, and temporality. My fixation with instrumental timbre has certainly been influenced by non-Western instruments' much broader color palettes in comparison to Western ones, as well as the inclusion of a wider range of sounds. The inclusion and acceptance of noise or sounds in addition to pure pitch can contrast with traditional Western approaches, which often focus on a purity of sound and technique. To demonstrate, I'll play an excerpt from a piece I wrote for Atlas Ensemble, which was workshopped. This is manifested in my writing for Western instruments, where I seek out playing methods which create more detailed and varied sounds, as well as techniques which can be considered fragile and not necessarily reliable, which can be considered antithesis to typical Western notions. A prime example of this would be my exploration and research into multiphonics across various different instruments and how they can be exploited to create rich and fascinating sonic results. Of course, Western composers have approached these types of ideas in various forms, but it was important for me to discover my own path through my navigation of intercultural thinking about sound. The very concept of combining or synthesizing Western and non-Western instruments and associated approaches to music was very interesting and useful for me as a way to forge my own compositional identity, whilst also considering my own mixed heritage between East and West, situated in this liminal space between cultural zones. A significant development in my practice was participation in Safa Ensemble's Composing for Sitar scheme. I had the opportunity to write for solo sitar. There's very little new or experimental music written for sitar, so I was really eager to create a work in this cross-cultural space between my practice and Jazz Deep's. So at our first session, the sitarist Jazz Deep Singh Digun informed me that we weren't going to work with notated scores, and he therefore wouldn't play the sketches that I had brought with me. He instead asked me to sing what I wanted him to play, engaging with oral transmission practices rooted in classical Indian music. I was immediately forced outside of my comfort zone, which was working with notated scores and certainly not singing. I realized that in my practice as a composer relying on said scores, I hadn't devoted time to thinking about how so many musical cultures operate without a reliance on these written scores. In my previous cross-cultural engagements, I had benefited from the luxury of working with musicians proficient in Western notation. While Jazz Deep was of course conversant in Western notation, it was clear that my compositional process had to be carried out differently. I therefore embarked on an extremely interesting project, grappling with the challenge of working within a cross-cultural space I was less accustomed to. I had to reconcile our different musical practices, preconceptions, and approaches to music making. I had to learn to work in a way which didn't rely on notated scores, as well as adapt my compositional approach to be more inclusive of Jazz Deep's musical practice, rooted in North Indian classical music. And in turn, Jazz Deep became more open to experimentation and incorporating sounds and techniques which you normally wouldn't utilize. We ended up working together closely over a period of several months. I would record sounds of other instruments or techniques, such as utilizing piano strings as a proxy for the sitar, and experimenting with the types of actions and sounds I wanted jazz to replicate or try out. Eventually, these sounds were codified in a text score, but the main method of transmission and composition and Jazz Deep learning their work was oral or sonic. This experience of performer-composer power dynamic was a crucial learning experience for me, particularly in this realm of cross-cultural work. Coming together with Jazz Deep to create a work collaboratively in this liminal space between two different musical cultures was a really special experience. I learned so much about collaborative practice and took away a lot in terms of bridging the gap between Western and non-Western music, navigating personal and cultural boundaries whilst also thinking through my own personal identity. In addition to my collaborative practice, my notational practice has been influenced by my cross-cultural engagements. I believe that it's important to use an appropriate method of notation for the context of the collaboration and the practice of the performer, as I discovered in my work with Jazz Deep. I've moved from a more traditional approach to notation and have developed a system of notation which tries to be less prescriptive and more open, especially in terms of duration, rhythm, and structure, while still maintaining a high degree of control in regard to sound production and timbre, as these are key elements of my practice. I'm also interested in having notation engage with the sonic result in some way, as well as reflecting concepts of negative space and silence visually. This has been particularly influenced by my study of Japanese approaches to silence, which then led me to learn more about composers such as Keijin Takemitsu's approaches, and more recently interacting with composers from the Wandelweiser collective. Through my studies, I've further developed my approach to silence as well as notation, attempting to refine it further, as well as developing a practice in using text scores, working with performers collaboratively, a process begun with Jazz Deep. I have therefore begun to utilize more text-based scores, as well as further develop my practice in oral transmission in these collaborative works, which have certainly been influenced by non-Western practices. So to conclude, much of my recent work has involved evaluating the different influences on my practice and how their convergence has helped create my compositional identity. A significant part of this has been my cross-cultural engagement in time spent occupying a space between Western music and musics of Japan, Korea, and India, as touched upon throughout this paper. However, it's important to note that working in a cross-cultural space carries certain elements that as a composer you should be acutely aware of. Sensitivity in this space is extremely important. You must be aware of the value of things that you can never fully understand, or understand in the ways that someone from that lived culture does. However, these collaborations are so fruitful and should be continued to be undertaken with the correct intention and approach, of course. I feel that this cross-cultural journey is important for me as a person of mixed heritage. The concept of liminality is useful in helping me describe this feeling of in-betweenness, of being between two spaces, one Western, one non-Western, while often at times not feeling entirely home in either space, but rather somewhere in between. I hope this has offered an insight into my approach to cross-cultural composition. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions or comments, and I look forward to the discussions during the symposium. Thank you.